I want to just pull the conversation down a little bit out of 35,000 feet and just say that it seems like the purpose for the story of Job, and both for the prose and the poetry section, is simply to answer the question, why do bad things happen?
Welcome to Cross Connections, Season 2, Cover to Cover, as we read along with you each week and discuss the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley,
Elliot Van Hoy,
and Natalie Hill. Join us as we discover how these stories connect us to God, to our inner selves, and to one another in a world that tries so hard to disconnect us. Welcome back, folks. I hope you enjoyed our series on the Psalms and a couple little break there for a couple of weeks. I hope that you're found yourself a little caught up getting through everything. We realize there's a lot of reading in this.
Maybe some beach reading you had.
Maybe like beach reading.
You took your big Bible, study Bible down to the beach or the lake or something. And
I hope you enjoyed the Psalms during your beach reading, and you didn't bring Job with you, which is what we're talking about today, because I'm not so sure that Job is the best beach reading. We're hitting Job here in just one session, although I'm sure it took many of you a few weeks to get through this whole text. There's a lot here.
Yeah, it's a big book.
Yeah, it's a big book. So, and thank you also for allowing us to go backwards in our Bible to pick up Job again.
Yeah, because someone messed up.
Yeah.
It's all good. No, you didn't mess up. You just really wanted to align the Psalms all in June.
Right.
I did.
At any rate, so here we are with the book of Job.
Where do we begin?
So should we just talk about where it came from and who wrote it? And because it was super quick answer. We have absolutely no idea.
Easy answer.
There's
speculation.
There's speculation. There's a couple parts to the book, and they are probably written at different times by different groups. And then there's at least one, if not more, editors who come through and string those bits together. But there's what we would call the prose part, the story part, which is the very beginning, where you have that interaction between God and the accuser, who I'm sure we're gonna talk about. And then terrible things happen to Job, and then there's another interaction, and then more terrible things happen to Job, and then there's the prose part continues at the very, very end. Where someone has come around to give the story a nice, neat ending, and all of the terrible things that had happened before, all undo themselves. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that too, because they undo themselves in some kind of wild ways.
Right.
But then there's the middle section where Job has this argument with these three friends, and then another friend who comes along, and the three friends want to tell him that everything that happened to him was all his fault.
Yeah.
And he fights back. The last other section you could probably talk about is then God coming to talk to the friends, but mostly to Job, and set things right. So we think that the prose section, the story part, was written first. It's a perfect story. It would make perfect sense if it had an oral tradition history. People sat around campfires and told this story to their kids. And I do want to talk about why they would have done that, but we can do that in a moment. And then the rest of it, what we call the poetry sections or the argument sections, are probably later. They have a more modern Hebrew to them. The language infuses some Aramaic, which tells us it's later. But we don't have there's literally like a 500-year period where this book could have been written in. And there's no other book I can think of where we have that much uncertainty over when the book was composed. There are scholars who say it was written before the Babylonian captivity. There are some who say it's during it. Some who say it's after it. There's just lots of theories out there.
Right.
And so when you're talking about these different sections, I know in my NRSV study Bible, you can kind of see the difference between prose and poetry because of the way that the paragraphs are set up. So just so I'm clear, I'm seeing mine seems to be chapters 1 and 2 are very prosy.
Yep.
And then 3 through, goodness, it's like
You're pretty
30
much
something.
Almost to the very end.
Pretty much to the
Yeah.
very end. Yeah.
3 through, definitely through 30.
The end of chapter 42.
Yeah, I'd
Exactly.
say through 31, there's kind of a shift there at 31, but it's still pretty poetry until, like basically the very last chapter.
Yep.
So that's what we're talking about, those sections that
Right.
that are formatted if you're reading probably the Message Bible isn't formatted that way, I don't know.
I'm not sure.
One of these kinds of texts is probably formatted differently and those would be kind of the two ends you're talking about.
Yes, like they definitely bookend the much longer poetry section, which is probably newer.
Yeah. So the frame is the prologue and epilogue. These are both
Short.
prose. They're short. They're paragraph form. It gives it almost this folklore-esque kind of telling, right? Like there once was a man named
A man from Uz.
Yeah, a man from Uz named.
Not an Israelite.
And we have no idea where Uz is.
No,
Like,
no clue.
this is not one of these stories where almost anyone thinks that it actually happened, that
Yeah.
there actually was this is a story.
This is a fairy
Yeah.
tale.
It's a story
Kind of.
like Jesus tells parables. Like
Right.
it's a story that's meant to convey truth, but its
Right.
truth doesn't mean that it historically happened.
Right.
Or a morality
Right.
tale.
So
Yeah.
to maybe piggyback on that, talking about, date, composition, we're not really sure the author. So we've gone backwards in our Bible from Psalms. So just as a reminder to everyone, we finished Esther and then we moved into this new section of our Old Testaments. Is it worth kind of talking about the category that Job finds itself within?
Are you talking about like the wisdom literature?
Poetical and
Yeah,
wisdom
yeah.
books, yeah.
Do we want to say anything about that? You have any thoughts? You want me to take it away? I just
Go
wanted
for
to,
it, smart guy.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about that. I just wanted to bring it up because that might have got lost in the mix of shifting from Esther to Psalms. Obviously, Psalms poetry. We've talked a lot about the poetry of it, but it might just be worth reminding everyone that this is a grouping of books that includes Job, Ecclesiastes, Psalms, Proverbs,
Sometimes Song of Solomon.
sometimes Song of Solomon. And I think it's maybe worth reminding people that this is a category of literature in the ancient world, wisdom literature. A lot of scholars do tend to think it developed around the exilic, post-exilic period, kind of as a result of interaction with Babylonian wisdom traditions, also an interaction, as we've said in previous podcasts, with just the trauma of this event, right, of going into exile, of national loss. I think one thing that's worth talking about, and we've circled around it a couple times, is the standard view of wisdom literature in the ancient Near East was very much rooted in the cycles of the natural world and a kind of correspondence with the orderliness of the moral world, right? That the natural world is orderly because God has created it, and that provides an analogy for our moral world. And a good example of that is Proverbs does this a lot, but take Proverbs 27, right? This is what it says. Anyone who tends a fig tree will eat its fruit. Anyone who takes care of a master will be honored, right? So it's like there's this correspondence, the orderliness and the kind of cause and effect of the natural world is very much mirrored in the orderliness of moral conduct. If I do good, blessing will accrue to me. If I do bad, if I commit sin, negative effects will accrue to me. So that backdrop is really important because throughout the wisdom literature of the Hebrew Bible, there's very much a dialogue with this view of wisdom. On the one hand, on this spectrum, you have Proverbs, which I just read from, which is very orderly. It's like, do this, this will happen. Then you have something like Job, which you're kind of beginning to see a tension with that view of the world, right? It's kind of, it is asking that question. Like the author is interacting with that view and saying, does this view hold up? How can we think about this? The friends of Job kind of play a part in that, right? We'll talk more about all of the details of the story, but Psalms, depending on what Psalm you're reading, some skew more towards that view of orderliness in natural and moral conduct. Some skew more towards like the righteous suffer, and that's mysterious. Ecclesiastes is obviously kind of on the far end of that, of like, you cannot rationally explain suffering, famously like vanity of vanities, meaninglessness. So I just wanted to bring up that whole backdrop as an important context for reading these books. Is the big question is really the question of, do good things happen to good people? And if not, why is that the case?
So they're all kind of held in tension with one another. It's hard to kind of read I mean, we are reading and discussing Job on its own, but you have to think about it in the context of the other books that, Psalms we've been through, these other ones we're going to be addressing in coming weeks. You have to kind of read Job in tension with these other ones that may have a different view of the interaction of good and evil, how God responds. It's so that the scriptures as a whole, this series of books, is not necessarily giving us one answer to this question.
Yes.
Which makes me feel a little bit better about Job, and I'll just say that right off.
I want to just pull the conversation down a little bit out of 35,000 feet and just say that it seems like the purpose for the story of Job, and both for the prose and the poetry section, is simply to answer the question, why do bad things happen? And specifically in terms of human history, and anthropologists will talk about this, when you have lots of gods, when you live in a polytheistic world, if you just think back to like Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology, Roman mythology, all the gods are
those Babylonians.
The Babylonians, they're all like mad at each other. They're jealous at each other. They're causing wars. They're fighting. They're killing each other. They're coming down. They're eating people, they're making babies. They're chopping people up. Like they're so much like us. And in all the bad parts that make us, but they're just bigger versions of us with more powers. And so it would make sense, I think, when you're living with that kind of worldview, that when a flood comes, when a massive fire happens, when an enemy army comes through and wipes out your entire village, I got caught up between the fighting of these gods. Like that, it sort of makes sense. The problem, and it seems to be like why Job was written, is when you come down to monotheism, one God, that when bad things happen, okay, I'm not caught between the fighting of different gods. Now does this God not like me? Does this God hate me? Is this God against me? And so Job seems to be written to sort of answer that question. Like, why I think I'm a decent person, this terrible thing has happened. Does that mean that God is against me? Does it mean that I did something wrong that deserved this? And I remember that when we talked to the Deuteronomistic history, that was the prevailing answer, was that terrible things happened because we did bad things, because we sacrificed to the wrong people, because we didn't live lives of justice and integrity.
Or sometimes because our leaders didn't. Or maybe we individually
absolutely
were
right. But the king did terrible things.
The king did terrible things and the people suffered.
But Job has a different answer than the Deuteronomistic historian.
I think that's helpful. Yeah, I think that's helpful to contextualize the answers a little bit different, and in some of the readings we've done previously. But wait a second, Rick.
I know where you're going.
I thought it was Satan, the devil, who did these things to Job. That's what it says. When I read my Bible, it says Satan wanted to test Job.
So
and make the Lord test Job.
We've heard this Satan before. Satan did stuff in First Chronicles to David, made him take a census. Yes, we did. And
that's a callback for people.
Yeah,
First Chronicles 21. Yeah.
You have to be a serious podcast listener. You need to have taken notes to remember that one. I barely remember that.
I did. I barely did.
That was all I could remember when I saw Satan. Was like, I know we talked about Satan before. Was it in a gospel conversation or in the Testament?
When we read Satan in our Bible, I mean, I don't know about you, but the first thing that pops into my mind is the image I have from my children's illustrated Bible of the little like half goat man with the horns and the goat haunches and legs, and he had a pitchfork in his hand, right? Like and he's the one who's on the one shoulder while the little nice angel's on the other shoulder, like trying to convince you to do the bad thing instead of the right thing.
There's a little green goblin in like the stained glass windows at the church I attend. It's like this little green horned goblin sort of thing that I'm like, I think that's supposed to be Satan.
I've never seen that. Wow. That might need to be the picture for this episode.
I think
I might have to go find
that. I think we need that.
Yeah.
But that's That's not who we're talking about here,
Right.
in Job. Like we have this view of Satan. We have there's the figure that tempts Jesus in the wilderness. That is not this person, this entity
In Job, right?
in Job, right? Different thing,
Because that develops a little later.
much later.
Right.
And is
that
the
idea.
language different?
So the Hebrew is hasatan, which simply means the accuser. And you see him here. It's sort of not quite court gesture, but the one who is the devil's advocate. That's probably a confusing metaphor now.
It is a confusing metaphor.
but-
he's the prosecutor.
There we go. Yeah.
It is the prosecutor. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think
the
there's a
accuser. Yeah,
gender.
it doesn't need to be gendered. The accuser is the prosecutor in this divine court. It's not an evil being or entity.
No.
It is someone.
This is not the Prince of Darkness.
No, it is
Right.
someone that kind of looks for iniquity and tests iniquity on behalf of God.
Yes.
And this is the same Hasatan from First Chronicles, right?
Yes.
But it's a different Hebrew word used later in the Gospels, tempting Jesus. Or is it the same?
Go ahead, Rick.
So that's a different language.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. Different. Right. Because
But
it's written in different
there's a long development. Elaine Pagels has a book, The Origins of Satan.
Yeah.
And excellent book, and sort of talks about how this idea emerged out of Judaism, but then Christianity sort of ran with it in a different direction.
Right.
And really set this figure up as the antithesis to God.
Yeah.
And then we almost ascribe to this figure like it's equal to God in power, which
Right,
it is
right.
never presented as such. And almost all of our iconography, except for the Green Goblin thing, which I've never heard before, comes from the god Pan, the little
Yeah.
half goat. We just
Right.
swap out the flute for.
I gotta just
fork.
say really quick for
Yeah.
the millennials listening. Every time you've said Green Goblin, all I can think about is the Spider-Man movie with Tobey Maguire.
As soon as I said Green Goblin, I'm like, now I'm thinking of this
Oh.
guy flying on the thing.
It's literally Willem
Yeah.
Dafoe,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
he's
yeah.
on that
Willem
little
Dafoe.
hoverboard,
Yep.
and,
Yes.
and he wears
That-
the really creepy mask.
That's who's in Job.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
who you should think about.
Maybe they saw the stained glass windows. in Trinity.
Maybe.
Wow.
So, point being, this is not a demonic figure.
No.
It is actually, in some sense, accurate to describe it as some sort of angelic figure.
Right.
There's this host of divine.
So
Yeah, they said heavenly beings.
Right.
You call this a heavenly court scene, and that's exactly what it is.
Right.
And we've talked about this before a couple times, but
Right.
it's a thing in the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, where God is there, and there are a lot of other divine beings around. And then we're going to ask questions. Well, are they gods? And we're going to go, let's not go there.
Yeah, right.
Because that's not what I mean in the Hebrew Bible mindset. There is only one God,
Right.
But a couple times in the Hebrew scriptures, there are these other divine beings, and are they cherubim, and are they seraphim, are they angels, are they something else, are they more or less? We don't know, and the text doesn't.
Right.
That's not. They're interesting questions, but they're not the questions the text is answering.
Right.
So there's this heavenly court scene, and this prosecutor, the Hasatan, starts provoking God.
Right. Yeah. And basically
So
saying,
who's on trial here? God's on trial?
in some sense, yes.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. I mean, he's like, well, Job is first presented as this blameless and upright.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like the best report card anyone gets
Yeah.
in the Bible, who's not Jesus, is Job.
Right.
And that's really important for the story. He's blameless.
And can I say,
Yeah.
I think this is like something Christian readers really struggle with, because they read that, oh, Job was upright and blameless. And I think immediately a red flag goes up in our head, and we're like, but he must have, he's human. He must have done something. And I think it's really important to emphasize that for the sake of this story, for the author of Job, Job is in fact blameless. He is completely righteous.
Blameless
Yes.
means without blame.
Without blame.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
and
yeah.
and so we can is he without original sin?
Right.
Like totally different conversation.
Totally.
It's not the point.
Remember,
No.
this is a story that was first told around a campfire.
Yes.
This is
Right.
not it's not answering that question.
Right.
But for the sake of this story, this is a blameless man.
Yes. And so the point of the prologue is he is in fact blameless. The prosecutor recognizes this, but the prosecutor's claim to God is he is only blameless because you have blessed him so much, right? So in chapter 1, verse 9, this is what the accuser says. It says, the accuser answered the Lord, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands. You've given him this, 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 and this. So there's these two scenes where first he destroys kind of all of his property and possessions, and Job still is like blameless. And so then he comes back to God and he's like, okay, well, now you need to hurt Job himself, right?
Before we get to what happens to Job, you have the accuser, claims, oh, well, you think this guy's so great, but it's only because of all this stuff you did. You made his life perfect. How could he possibly
have done anything
act
else
against you?
Right.
When he has everything he could ever want.
Yep.
And God's like, yeah, okay. Well, let's test this. Go ahead and do whatever you want to my perfect follower.
Just don't touch his body.
Yep.
The first time he's like,
don't kill him.
No, I think the first time is don't touch him.
Yes.
You're right.
Yep.
I'm sorry.
And
It's don't kill
so
him
like
later.
all of Job's children are slaughtered.
Yes.
All of his stuff is taken
there's
away.
wave after wave of messengers who come to him, and each
Right.
one has worse news than the last one.
And like immediately upon the heels of the first one.
Right. The next
one is
one
coming.
comes, and there's like a raiding army, and then there was a storm,
Like
and then there was an
absolutely
earthquake.
no break between.
Right. It's just bad news after bad news after bad news, and he still doesn't curse God.
Yep. He falls on the ground and worships.
Right. And then the accuser, the Hasatan, goes back to God, and God says, look, he did all right. And the prosecutor says, well, it's only because you haven't touched his body.
Right,
Like he doesn't really care about his kids.
Yep.
Or
You
his
gave me this
goats,
limit last time. Yeah.
Right. And so he said, all right, now you do whatever you want with him. Just don't kill him.
Yep.
And so then he afflicts his body with these like oozing, pussing sores. And he still does not curse God, even though his wife comes to him and says, why don't you just curse God and die? By the way, this is just a little nerdy Bible stuff, but the Hebrew there does not say curse God. It actually says bless God. And it says bless God. It means curse, but the author of the story could not bring themselves to put the word curse next to God.
Right.
And so they said bless God,
Wow.
but meaning curse God. Anyway.
That's awesome fact. I didn't know
Yeah.
That is
That's a
very
good
interesting.
fact.
I was wondering why the little thing Hebrew says bless. I'm like,
hadn't
what?
known
Curse
that.
and bless are two very different things.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I just want to stop for a moment and be like, for real. When I first read this, my initial response was like, what the hell, God? Sorry,
Yeah.
pardon my language if anybody's like, what?
Yeah.
W.
TH. Yeah. Yeah.
That was just the most awkward.
What is going on here, God? Why are you just doing this to this person out
Yeah.
of nowhere? It feels so wrong, and it does
Right.
not feel particularly godly.
So
I just like
most of the books of the Bible, the biblical authors are trying to present God in a very favorable light, right? Like
Right.
because God's God, right? But this story really isn't about that. This story is about Job being blameless and upright and all these things happening to him. And so the question is why? Yes, it's super awkward
because
that
God decided
that-
it was okay to mess with
Right.
let the
Like-
accuser mess with him.
I mean, in the lines of the story, God killed all of Job's children.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Dropped buildings on them.
Right.
I mean, that's terrible.
All at the same
And if
time.
that's what the story was about, that would be a really terrible story.
Right.
But it's an old story that is about Job being as close to perfect as one can get,
Right.
and still having this incredibly terrible thing happen to him.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think the point, while this is, I don't think it solves issues when we say this is a story. Like stories can still perpetrate tremendous evil, like
Sure.
and horrendous views. But I do think it's amazing that you just said that, Natalie, because I think that is literally the intended effect of this story. Is you are supposed to say, "What the heck, God?" Because that is in fact Job's response to God.
Yes.
I think it's very important to understand. We've talked about this accuser as a prosecutor, and we've used this language of like trial and court. I think one of the things that really fundamentally shifted my understanding of Job when I first studied it was, I think a lot of times we just think of Job as a book that's like dealing with the problem of evil. And while that's not like completely wrong, I think that's like way too grandiose of what's going on. Job is this courtroom scene. It is Job trying to bring God to trial, and that's literally the language that's used. So if you look even at chapter 13, we haven't gotten much into Job's friends, but they stink. They've been giving Job horrible answers. They're looking for some answer of why Job is having all of these things happen to him.
Right.
He must have sinned. He must have done something, right?
This sounds like how we behave in
Yes,
real life. We're
it
always
does.
trying to figure out why,
Yes.
that person
right.
was
Very,
wonderful, suddenly
very
got-
practical. And Job says in 13, look, my eye has seen all this, my ear has heard and understood it. What you know, I also know. I am not inferior to you. But I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to argue my case with God.
Yeah.
And so this is literally legal
a trial
language. Yeah, it's very much like, no matter what you say, I am blameless. I'm going to continue to argue my case with God. And in fact, in the first response of Job to the Lord later in the book, which we'll probably talk a little bit about, God confronts Job. And if you caught it, Job's first response is like, I'm not taking back anything that I said.
So the only thing I would disagree with you about, Elliot, is I think, yes, you're absolutely right. The legal language is all throughout the poetry section, but in the prose section, in just the story, we haven't gotten. I think that is about the origins of evil and how terrible things can happen. And then obviously someone read that story and was like, we need a little more here. We need to flesh this out. And so that's why the other 30 some chapters were written, to give us Job, his friends going after him, and Job going after his friends and going after God and presenting his case that he was blameless and did not deserve this. I think we should say a little bit about the friends, because this is probably, if someone hasn't really studied Job, you probably only know the first couple chapters and maybe the last chapter. But so Job has these terrible things happen to him. His friends come and they sit with him for 7 days in silence. In the Jewish tradition, we would call this sitting Shiva. And I that is so beautiful. Right. Like
they didn't say anything.
As a priest, like when I walk into a room where like some terrible tragedy has happened, that there's no words.
No words.
There's nothing to say. The only thing you can offer them is is your presence and your care and your love. And that's what the friends do here. They sit for 7 days in silence with Job in his grief. And that is beautiful. And then they open their mouth and the whole thing goes south from there, because their argument then is, sorry, but you deserved this.
There must have been something.
Right.
Some reason.
And if you think about like going back to the Deuteronomistic historian, who we were in for weeks and weeks, if you told the Deuteronomistic historian that there's this figure, and on one day all of his children were killed and all of his wealth went away, and then his own personal health was decimated, why do you think that happened? The Deuteronomistic historian would have said, that person deserved it. Terrible things like that do not befall you unless you have deserved it. You've either done something or you've failed to do something. And that is the basic argument of these three friends. And they have different ways of arguing, each of them, but they either want to say you did something and you don't know it, you did something and you're lying about it, or there's a bunch of stuff you didn't do. You didn't feed the hungry, you didn't care for the widow, you didn't, and therefore you must have deserved this.
There has to be something. It's very much this view of events in our lives as discipline. And this is actually, so the three friends are Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Zophar's the worst, I think.
He is.
And most people agree. Eliphaz comes first, and in chapter 5, verse 17, this is what he says, and it's very much the view of the Deuteronomistic historian, right? chapter 5, verse 17, how happy is the one whom God reproves. Therefore, do not despise the discipline of the Almighty, right? So very much it's like, well, Job, you're just being disciplined right now, and that's okay. That's a good thing. I think this is great because, like you said, Natalie, I don't know about you, but I can certainly think of times in my life that I had some of Job's friends. I had people that were like, God, all things come from God. Like God knows what God's doing, and something horrible just happened in my life, right? Mm-hmm. And it's the worst thing someone can do. It's just horrible. It doesn't make you feel better. It gives you a really bad view of God, and I don't think it's very helpful.
God's got something better for you.
Totally.
Oh man,
I can't. I don't want to name circumstances, but I'm
right,
just currently imagining circumstances in
Absolutely.
which I'm like, that is one of the worst things you could possibly say.
100%. And Job has the best line in response to them. But I think you're right, Rick, that their first response offers us actually the better way, right, of presence, of sitting with people. So I think that is meant to be.
If the book had ended there,
right.
It would be this beautiful book.
Yep. It'd be amazing, and it would be a great model.
Shiva with him.
Yeah,
they'd be heroes.
Yes,
right?
They'd be heroes, and they get rebuked at the end of the book. Like, let's remember and point that out to people. God rebukes these friends.
God says they did not say what is right of me.
Yes, they did not say what is right of me.
They were wrong.
Yes, and I referenced chapter 13 already. I think this is an important chapter. This is also where Job says of his friends. This is verse 4 and 5. As for you, my friends, you whitewash with lies. All of you are worthless physicians. If you would only keep silent, that would be your wisdom.
Yeah.
And like that, I feel like I should just like post that in my office.
Oh man.
If we would only keep silent.
I just need to keep silent more in these types of situations that require it.
When dealing with people's grief.
Yeah, right.
If you would only keep silent.
Yeah. Which is really great. I mean, it's great wisdom. So you know this, Natalie and Rick. Some of the listeners may know this, but might not. If you don't know me super well, I just did 9 months of hospital chaplaincy at Lankenau. Yep. And one of the things in that chaplaincy program we discussed was 9 times out of 10. Really, I feel like it's accurate to say 10 times out of 10. But I'll be generous and say 9 times out of 10. When we speak into someone's suffering and grief, it almost always has to do with ourselves and not with them.
Totally.
You see what I know Rick already knows what I'm saying, which is like when someone is sitting in pain and suffering, what we feel like we need to say for them in that moment is usually addressing some uncomfort or discomfort in ourselves, something in our own past, something in our own narrative. Like we think we're speaking into their pain and grief and suffering, but really we're just like Job's friends, filling it with these words and narratives that really probably aren't actually helpful.
So I want to give a resource real quick. There's a book by Megan Devine, Devine. It's called "It's Okay That You're Not Okay." Mm-hmm. It's about it's written by a woman who watched her husband drown in front of her.
Wow.
And she was a therapist. She's a therapist, and she thought she had everything she needed to meet her grief. And then she started dealing with other people. And she goes through the list of just terrible things that people weren't trying to be terrible. They were trying to assuage her.
Yes,
right. Oh, you'll meet another man, right? God just needed another little angel in heaven.
Yep.
I just lost a dog, so I know how you feel, right? Like perfectly well-meaning, but terrible things. And people say these things out of their own insecurities, and because it's uncomfortable, and because it's uncomfortable dealing with this person, but it's also this person is also bringing up things inside of you that you haven't quite healed from. And in that perfect storm, like the stupidest things come out of your mouth,
dumbest thing.
And so, do not say anything.
Yes.
You go, you bring a casserole, you hug them, sit there with them.
You love them.
If you want me to clean your house, I'll clean your house. Like, what do you need? I'll pick your kids up from school. I'm there for you. But don't try and take their pain away
Yeah.
by your words.
There's another resource to give people. There is a phenomenal article by a guy named Parker Palmer, and this is on the website, the On Being Project. And so if you just look up Parker Palmer, the name of the article, it's a short article, is, and what a title, "The Gift of Presence, the Perils of Advice."
Yeah.
And it's exactly what you're saying, Rick,
absolutely.
of the way we, as a culture and as an American culture, this isn't a timeless or universal thing. I think it is certainly something about our culture. We are obsessed with trying to give advice and to try and speak into pain and suffering. And we are really uncomfortable with just being present to people.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, we always feel like we have to answer a question, answer things for people, fix it. And
yeah.
what people usually just need is our presence.
Right.
Yeah, but of course the friends here aren't just trying to fix Job.
Right. Yeah, it's even worse than that.
It's even worse than
Blame
that.
him.
You deserved this.
Yeah.
You deserved
Yeah.
it. Which I've met people like that.
No, Job, it might be that
Yeah. Wow. I think it's you.
Yeah. Right.
I was just sorry, we changed tacks. I was just going to say that one of the things I think is really, in other cultures, there are some other cultures where they have people who do that, like wailing for people in grief. I feel like if you're going to do anything,
Yeah.
Seriously.
just wail.
So,
Seriously.
but
Anyways,
maybe
but yeah,
before we
these-
turn to kind of Job's discourses towards God and God's discourses towards Job, I'm curious if y'all have any like favorite Job lines, because he gets pretty intense with some of his description of his suffering. Did y'all have any? There was a few that I thought were really good.
Early on, he's like, "I wish I wasn't born.
Yep.
I wish
Yeah.
the day I was conceived never happened." There's a bunch of that in like chapter 3 and chapter 4.
I don't know. I did like when he yelled at his friends to be like, "You think you know better than me?"
Yeah,
I
right.
did. We already brought that one up, but that was one of my favorite ones. Like, if you think I'm an idiot,
My favorite line of Job's, and it's one of those passages that is wildly misunderstood.
Okay.
But it's, "I know that my Redeemer
Yes,
lives, and
yes.
that at the last he will stand upon the earth. And
Yes.
in my body I shall see God, who my eyes will behold, who is my friend
Used.
and not a stranger," which is used throughout Christian liturgy.
Lots of funerals.
Yeah.
In the Episcopal Church, it's one of the opening anthems that is said at the very beginning of a funeral, and it's meant to evoke the Redeemer, Jesus, who's going to come, and our Redeemer's our friend, and that's lovely. And the Handel's Messiah setting to that is even more lovely. "I know that my Redeemer lives." Lovely. It is not what Job is talking about at all. The Redeemer, it's sort of going back to your point earlier,
Yeah.
Elliot. The Redeemer that he has in mind here is a lawyer.
Yes.
That
it is
going
part
to-
of this law courtroom imagery.
that is going to stand between Job and God and present the case to God
Yep.
that God has done Job wrong, and that this Redeemer, this lawyer, is going to win the case against God.
Yeah. Right.
And so I love it. I love the spunk of Job there. I do, like every funeral, I kind of go just a little bit,
yeah.
because it's right there, and
Right.
I'm like, again, I get the sentiment.
Totally.
I love my Redeemer, absolutely, but that's not the Redeemer that Job was
Right.
talking about.
In some ways, it's not that different. I mean, it's the same Hebrew, right? Goel as
kinsman redeemer.
Kinsman redeemer.
That's exactly right.
Of
Yeah.
Boaz with Ruth.
So
That's
he's
what I was
he's going to be the Boaz. He's
Yep.
calling for a Boaz to come and stand
Yes.
and protect him from God.
Right. Yep. And basically to present the case.
Yeah, because it's the part where the friends have been saying, "You deserve this, you deserve this, you deserve this," and he doesn't. Job never internalizes, "Okay, yeah,
Yep.
maybe I did something wrong," but he does internalize it up to the point where, well, God treated me like I did something wrong. God punished me,
Yes.
but he did it unjustly because I'm blameless and upright.
Yes.
And we, as the readers, know from the very opening line that Job is blameless and upright, that Job didn't do anything to deserve the things that befell him.
Yes.
But Job gets wrapped up in it, and he
Yeah.
wants his day in court.
Yeah, and part of the challenge here is Job maintains that it's kind of quite radical. He maintains that he is in fact just, that he is in the right,
Yeah.
and God is in the wrong.
God is wrong.
God is acting unjustly. That's part of the kind of court claim. But the problem is, it's not just a matter of justice, it's a matter of power. And so part of why he feels he needs this redeemer, and he's kind of exclaiming for this redeemer, if you go back, say, to Job 9, right? Job is maintaining his innocence there. So take Job 9:15. Though I am innocent, I cannot answer God. And why can't he answer him? Well, he says in verse 17, for God crushes me with a tempest and multiplies my wounds without cause. He will not let me get my breath. He fills me with bitterness. If it is a contest of strength, he is the strong one. So it's very much this like, I've
been wronged by the big corporation that crushes the little person. Right.
So like, even though I know I'm just, even though I know I'm in the right, I don't have the power to contend.
But if I had a lawyer who was able to like stand on equal footing, then that lawyer could bring a case, and I would win.
Yep, exactly.
Because even Job here is still in the mindset that God blesses the righteous and punishes the wicked.
Right.
And that's it.
Yes.
And it's not how this story works.
Right.
It's not what the story tells us.
Right. So if someone hadn't read this and we're leading them through this, we're really problematizing kind of the way God is acting here. You're kind of hoping for this denouement in which, okay, God is going to justify God's self and kind of give the answer. So what is the answer?
Right here, God's going to solve the problem of evil.
Yes.
And why terrible things happen to good people.
Right.
And why good things happen to bad people. Right. And that's in what chapter?
Yep.
Where are we going?
Don't worry. It's right there. You'll find it. Just keep flipping.
Just keep flipping. I can't
promise
find it
it's
yet.
there.
I've read this book an awful
30.
lot.
So
I did.
in all,
So we talked about the three friends who were,
and then there's another
kind of
friend that
jerks.
shows up.
Yeah, then there's this other friend who, what I thought was just really strange, just wanted to point out, the end of chapter 31, the words of Job are ended. It's just, here's like the poetry of him speaking, et cetera, et cetera. Then the words of Job are ended.
Yeah.
And now we're going to hear from, suddenly a fourth guy shows up. Elihu,
who's even,
and he's angry.
well, and he's angry at everybody. He thinks the friends have been soft on Job and that Job is a terrible person.
right.
Yeah, he's a real winner.
Yeah.
And what's funny is that then he talks for several chapters.
32 to 37 is Elihu's speeches.
Right. Before then God shows up.
Before God shows up in the whirlwind.
In the whirlwind and addresses Job.
Dressed as Job, does he address the problem of evil?
Does
the
he?
problem of suffering?
I mean, he starts off by just saying, like, who do you think you are?
Oh, he starts up with Rick's favorite phrase, gird up your loins.
Gird your loins. He does.
38:3. Gird your loins like a man. Man.
Yeah. And I do have to say, I love the speech from God.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, I always see it as like, if Genesis chapter 1 is the firfirst story of creation and Genesis chapters 2 and 3 is the second giving of the story of creation, this is the third.
Right.
Because
interestingly enough, God does not justify God's self and God's justice. In fact, it's like God just completely bypasses Job's contest of justice, right? Of saying like, answer me, you've been unjust, and basically just says, well, look at everything I've done. And as you said, almost presents this narrative of creation. I love, speaking of like lines in the book, and I was asking y'all if y'all had any favorite Job lines, because there's some really good ones of like, I wish I had never been born. I wish I had gone right into the grave. I think my favorite line from God that like genuinely makes me laugh out loud as I'm reading it is in chapter 38. It's, where were you when I did this in creation? Where were you when I did this? Where were you when I did this?
Right.
And you get to 19 and it's, okay, Job, where is the way to the dwelling of light? Where is the place of darkness? And you drop down to 21, and God goes, I can't even say it without laughing, surely you know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great. It's like just the most sarcastic.
Yes.
That might be one of the most sarcastic Bible verses in the entire Bible. And I absolutely think it's hilarious. But yeah, God almost kind of bypasses the question.
Yeah.
Isn't that right?
Yeah.
Well, and yeah.
Which sort of is the answer.
And then
Right.
the Lord says to Job at the very beginning of 40, shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? Anyone who argues with God must respond. This is exactly what Job was just saying.
Yeah.
I can't come to God with my complaint because God's got all the power. And,
Right.
and God right here is just justifying exactly what he was saying. Yep, you're right.
Yeah.
How dare you?
But I love Job's response because so there's this first one, and then Job's response, this first discourse of God towards Job of, where were you when I created this and did this? And then it ends with, as you pointed out, Natalie, the Lord saying, all right, you think you're the big man on campus? So go ahead. You must respond to everything I just said. And Job, the phrasing, the words are a bit weird, but Job's response is basically like, hey man, I already said this. I'm not saying it again. Like I already said it once. So he says, I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once and I will not answer, twice, but will proceed no further. So then that prompts the Lord to go back onto another, like, all right, gird up. We're
That's
going
right.
in again.
Did you let the wild ass go free? Right? Yeah.
You just wanted to be able to say that.
I really did. That's my
You
favorite
were waiting.
line. Or
I
do you know
was
when
looking at it. It was
do you know when the mountain goats give birth?
There's,
Yeah.
I think again though, the shift from, it's really interesting. It's almost a shift from justice to power on God's part, where, and you really see it in chapter 40, the second discourse of the Lord in verse 8 and 9, where God recognizes Job is kind of putting him in the wrong. God says in verse 8, will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be justified? And verse 9 says, have you an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like his? Which
Deck
is
yourself with majesty and dignity, clothe yourself with glory and splendor.
right. Which I will say personally has always been an answer I am deeply unsatisfied by.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I don't know. I wonder if listeners feel that way.
Here's how I see it. Remembering that particularly this section is poetry, right? Is that when we are suffering, we are, all of us are turned in on ourselves, right? Like our suffering is all we can see.
All consuming.
Right? All consuming. Like every horizon is our suffering, is the loss, the pain, the grief, the anger, all of it. And in this section, I mean, God's a little arrogant the way God does it. But what God does is he lifts up Job's head to see the world around him, where there are creatures who live and die and give birth, live and die. He shows the sun rises, the sun sets. The world has great beauty. The world experiences birth, life, death, and the whole thing. Look at it all.
Right.
And I don't think that's great advice for the person who has just experienced suffering, but it is, as one is coming out of suffering, for one to sort of lift their head up and realize, the sun rose today. Right. Like, all right, there's a larger world out there. And I like that. And I think it's kind of where the poetry is leading us, even beyond the arrogance.
Yeah.
And the satire.
I think that's helpful to see.
And the fact that in this book, where it's 42 chapters long, the question it's dealing with is, why did all this stuff happen to Job? Right? We don't get an answer.
No.
And so what is the answer to suffering in this world? There is no answer.
Right.
But the answer isn't that we deserved it.
Right.
When I suffer, when you suffer, when a country suffers, when a people suffer, it's not because they deserved it.
Right. Yes.
Blessing does not just follow righteousness, and destruction does not just follow wickedness. It's not how the world works.
Right.
And we need to get our minds off of that track.
Right.
And that is where I think the book of Job succeeds wonderfully, even though it does it with some ancient turns that are really hard on our modern brains. This doesn't sound right. And God does not come out looking like a great being here.
No,
it seems capricious.
It feels like the answer is, why does bad stuff happen to us? Because God felt like it. Like that just, I mean, like,
Yeah.
because somebody questioned God,
Mm-hmm.
and God needed to prove himself in court. Is like that's the way it's presented. Because the only answer God gives, God does not give an answer to Job for what happened. So the only thing you can go back to is, where did this start?
Yeah.
Which was that the accuser came at God, and God said, "Well, fine, have at it."
Yeah. Right.
And so, like, again, that doesn't feel
good. But if you lived in a world where everyone told you that every bad thing, so when I was a teenager, I got in a car accident. I totaled my dad's car. I was driving to youth group, and
wow.
I remember you told this in a podcast.
Did I?
Yeah,
Oh.
what he said. Right?
I've already told the story.
I think you might very briefly, because I remember it. You either told it off air or on a podcast, because you said when you got home.
So
your dad said
my dad said this was my fault. Like
Right.
it was because I was basically a sinner.
right.
So wait, your father?
My father told
you
me
that
I
you-
got in a car accident because I was a sinner.
Yes.
And that rattled me. And that, I didn't believe it. Like I wasn't like, oh, I must have sinned terribly, but like that ate at me. And it was the book of Job. I think one of the reasons why I have a soft spot in my heart for Job was because like it was able to speak to that kid, me, all those years ago, and be like, that wasn't because it was anything you did. It wasn't
Right.
because I was a sinner.
Right. Right. I also find it helpful to kind of separate the poetry sections and the prose sections.
Yeah.
I am actually not the biggest fan of the prose sections of this like narrative of, oh, there's this divine court and the accuser comes to God, and God and this accuser have this back and forth, and so they agree on this agreement. Like if you take that out of the story just begins in 3 with Job cursing the day of his birth. So it just begins with this person that is suffering. There's no reason for his suffering. That's discernible, but he is
Yep.
suffering.
Yep.
Right.
So to completely lop off 1 and 2, right?
Yeah.
You have a person that suffers. That's exactly our lives. We suffer. Oftentimes we're not sure of our suffering. Of course, there's times we suffer as a result of our own doing, but oftentimes our suffering is inexplicable, right?
Yeah.
Someone we know dies of cancer, right? There's not an explanation for that. You get into a car accident, there might be local explanations of it was a drunk driver or something happened, but like oftentimes inexplicable events in our lives. And you have these friends that are trying to speak into it, and they're trying to give answers. And I love that the poetry concludes with God saying, none of those people spoke for me. There is no reason that can be given for your suffering. Yeah. And as you pointed out beautifully, Rick, instead of giving you a reason for why these things have happened, I'm going to lift you up. I'm going to give you this cosmic vision.
Yeah.
And instead of answering this complaint you have, I'm going to give you an experience. Because we haven't talked about it yet, but I love the way Job describes it for himself, right? Because I can impose my own perspective on how it's going. But Job's own response to the experience in chapter 42 is he describes what he had done, right? So this, in my book, this is in air quotes, basically. So this is verse 4 of 42. So Job's looking back on how he had treated God. And this is what he said to God: "Hear and I will speak. I, Job, will question you, God, and you, God, will declare to me." So Job's kind of almost mocking his former way of being.
Right.
And then this is how he describes where he's at after the cosmic vision in verse 5. He's describing where he's gotten to. "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you."
Yeah.
And so to me, while I've never been fully satisfied by it, I do think that it is presenting this experience of God that goes beyond kind of the desire for needing an answer.
Yeah.
Which is not satisfying, because if you're anything like me,
then he despises himself and repents in dust and ashes. So he's repenting of having questioned God for God.
He's upset with himself for wanting to lawyer up and sue God. Yeah.
I think the note in my Bible is very helpful here. And this, I'll just read what it says, because I do agree with it. It says, it puts repent in italics and says, Job has never acknowledged any sin, so he cannot be repenting in that sense. The verb means rather, quote, be comforted. Job means he will now end his period of mourning in dust and ashes and resume his normal life. So it's funny, when you just read it, it's like, that doesn't sound like what it's saying at all. The note is almost saying it's saying the opposite of what it seems to be saying, which I see their point there.
Yeah.
Teshuva, repent means to turn. And I think he's turning from, like, he realizes that he went off the deep end a little bit with God, not prior to the hurt, but after his friends came and were terrible to him, that he got caught up in it. That's where I'm reading that what he's turning from.
Yeah.
So maybe I disagree with the Oxford annotated Bible. But
You might be. Yeah, it sounds like it's so interesting. It sounds like they are.
I don't think he's saying that he has something to repent of.
Right.
That caused the suffering. Like that's not, but that he's repenting. He's turning away from, he's not going to be asking to lawyer up anymore against God.
Yeah.
He's turning from that.
Interesting. Yeah, that would be something for readers to go pursue, is different renderings of chapter 42, verse 6.
I do want to say the very ending is deeply unsatisfying to me.
Yes.
And were we laughing about it during the podcast or right before?
Right before.
Right before that, at the very end, all of Job's children have been killed. But don't worry, because he gets new children.
Yeah, right.
But here's what you've earned: a new car,
A new family. No problem. And like he gets all his camels and his sheep and his oxen. He gets more than he had before. So he had lost all of his wealth. And so he gets more wealth than he has. Okay. I get that. But like that he gets just more kids. That just is deeply unsatisfying to me. I see this book being written sort of in strata. And I think the very early chapters were probably older. And then someone was like, we need a little more. And then so someone came along and wrote the sections of the friends and the story of God coming in the whirlwind. And then someone's like, we need to button this up. And we need to give a nice little, and everyone lived happily ever after, which is exactly what we want to do with grief. And while the rest of the book invites us to sit in our grief in silence, someone came along and was like, we need to like put a bow on it.
Totally.
Yeah. Yep. If you think about it that way, you've got that first section that ends with the friends sitting with him in his grief. And that feels like his grief isn't fully resolved, but he has these friends surrounding him, and there's something beautiful to that. There's also something, if we read it in some of the ways that you're talking about, and a little less that, God was being, playing games or whatever with his life, and more like, I am God, and look at all of this amazing creation. And for you, the sun still rises. And for you, the grain is still in the field for you to eat. And for you, you're still alive and have chances for whatever, For you, all of this is here, and for everybody else, and it's not just about you. And coming to that realization, within the grief of, you can almost imagine at the end of that section in 42, after the end of verse 6 of chapter 42, Job finding a way to integrate his grief into his life, and that's also beautiful.
Yeah.
This other ending kind of just. It's like, oh, we're just going to pretend like those people who had been in your life, we're not going to talk about them. We're going to pretend like they didn't mean anything. And like all of this is going to make up for it. And we know that it doesn't work like that. Yeah.
And yet some author felt like they needed to go against everything else that was done in the book.
Job's a weird one. I mean, as a piece of scripture, it's a weird one.
It is strange. I just want to say, in the midst of y'all's marvelous discussion, and I was listening, and I was also looking up Job 42:6, because this is really perplexing me now that we've discussed it.
Okay.
And it is, in fact, a serious translation issue. There's a big debate about how to understand the Hebrew of chapter 42, verse 6, and like what Job is actually saying here.
Wow.
Yeah. I just found a whole
Like a textual issue?
Like really like what is the Hebrew saying? So there's the idea, and even different translations translate it in various ways. There's the idea that's really represented in the text here in English of a repentant Job, right?
Yep.
I despise myself, I repent in dust and ashes. There's one that kind of is a middle way where Job is withdrawing his demand for vindication. And so it translates it more as I recant, I relent, I'm just dust and ashes. Like I recognize, So there's
You're
not
God
so
and I'm
much.
not.
Yeah,
Okay.
you're God and I'm not. It's more on the power thing. Some actually even translate it as rebellious. That translation would be something like, therefore, let's see what it says here. Therefore, I feel loathing, contempt, and revulsion toward you, God. I am sorry for frail man. Like it's kind of sarcastic and ironic. I guess the Hebrew is really complicated here, but interestingly, based on the note in the NRSV about how to understand the Hebrew word for repentance in this context, I found an article here that translates it this way, which is very interesting. Therefore, I am both overwhelmed and comforted, being but dust and ashes.
Oh, that would make really good sense after God's speech.
It would.
Because
I'm going to have to read. I'm not saying I agree with that. I mean, it's very fast. This is very fascinating to me, but it sounds like that's the note they were trying to make sense of as well. Of like, there's some sense of comfort in here. Anyway, really just nerded out on that. I apologize.
That's awesome.
It's a great reminder, though. At the end of the day, I think this is one of the truisms of this podcast. Understanding Scripture is never quite as easy as it seems.
yeah,
It's
it's why we do it together.
that's why we do it together.
It's true. Sorry. I guess we could leave it there.
Yeah.
I was just going to mention that what's his name, Elihu, doesn't come back. The Lord yells at the other three guys.
He does, but
What's the name?
yeah, I know. There's
Like,
no
that fourth guy. It's like he never existed.
Just pops in, pops out.
That's because it was probably written later.
Yeah.
Just shoved in there.
a different strata. Yeah.
Yeah.
All these layers of this story.
Yep.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Interesting book. You seem unsatisfied, Natalie. That's okay.
I don't find Job terribly satisfying. I'll just
Yeah.
go with that.
Yeah.
Interesting. There's some real fun things are said.
Yeah.
I appreciate similarly to the Psalms, the ability to kind of get angry with God over something. Although this feels a little bit like it says, well, you shouldn't get angry with God because God is all.
Yeah.
But,
I think it's in some ways an awkward book.
Yeah.
But it moves the conversation forward in an incredible way. This is an
Right.
incredibly progressive text.
That's a great point.
For its time. And Jesus will take it even further when talking about suffering and talking about rain falling on the just and the unjust and sun shining on the righteous and the unrighteous. That the point being that you aren't responsible for every disease, every natural disaster, every terrible thing that happens to you. That is a huge burden lifted off of humanity and all of us. And it's strange, and the storylines are strange, and the poetry is strange, and we don't even know what these verses, this last verse means. But it's still it takes us, humanity, much further down the road when talking about suffering.
Right.
And I suppose that exegesis is more important than my eisegesis of how I feel about it.
Wow.
Well,
Sorry,
I think,
I watched this little video on, what's his name? Joseph Yu? I'll have to find it. He's an Episcopal priest who I follow on Instagram, and he was talking about exegesis versus eisegesis. And I kept wanting to say something because I was realizing there's this exegesis of this, and then there's how I feel about it, which is more of the...
So
exegesis,
for our friends,
for our listeners, so our friends.
Exegesis is interpreting a text to see what the text says. Eisegesis is turning the text into something that you want it to say.
Yeah. So, I mean, the literal word ex, out of, you're trying to get the information out of the text. Eis in eisegesis is into. Right. You're putting things into the text. That's kind of the classic breakdown of, like, are you trying to get something out of it, or are you trying to put something into it? I actually find that dichotomy binary, like, not very helpful. I think it actually is working with an understanding of reading that, like, we're just these kind of rational beings that pick up books and, like, gather information from them. It doesn't recognize that, like, we are always carrying our presuppositions with us. When we read text, they are always interacting with our narrative, our stories, the data and views that we have. I think we can always try and do the careful work of getting trying to read well, and we do that on this text. Like, when was it written? What's its composition? What's the context? What's the type of literature that it is?
Where was it for its time? Like your explanation of it being really progressive for its time and moving the conversation forward. If you just read this on its own like this, get a completely different sort of a...
Yeah.
There was a popular T-shirt when I was in seminary. Do you know what?
I feel like I don't know exactly where you're going with that.
Exegesis saves.
That's horrible. That's such a cheesy joke. That is such a cheesy joke.
I know.
This guy said something about eisegesis sounds like I see Jesus. Where you see... the meaning. Anyways.
Interesting.
I thought it was just interesting because it feels like there's an interplay, that there's not necessarily two separate things that you're doing this or that, but that you're always doing both.
We always bring our text selves into the text.
Yep.
Yeah.
Always.
I want us to close with one comment on Job, because I feel the unsatisfaction you feel with this book, Natalie. And I think you highlighted it really well, that this is progressing in its time. And then when we get to the text we hold as followers of Jesus in the New Testament, we continue that journey. And I'm thinking of even the difference between God's discourse in Job of like, sheathe yourself in glory, like, look at me, I've created all these things, to what we get in the New Testament with this God that dwells among us, that weeps when Lazarus dies. And I'm even thinking of Paul in particular talks a lot about God's power being precisely manifested not in displays of power of creation, but in death and crucifixion, right?
In weakness.
In weakness. I mean, 2 Corinthians 12:9, my power is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect, and my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness, right? And so I think this is an important continuation of Job, of presenting an alternative view.
Yep.
So I'll leave it at that. That'd be a whole nother podcast, but awesome. I think don't stop at Job. I think the story continues.
Yeah. Well, we've got quite a lot of scripture left
We do.
to
We got a lot of Bible
here.
to go.
Yeah.
I know this is episode 34, or at least the 34th new
Oh my gosh,
episode.
that's crazy.
Something along those lines. We've got a ways to go until December.
Not even in the New Testament, and we're 34 episodes in. Woof.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's been a lot here.
Good stuff.
All right, well, we will continue with wisdom literature next week. Thanks for
See you then.
suffering through Job with us. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cross Connections Cover to Cover. New episodes drop each Wednesday. Please be sure to follow or like us on your favorite podcasting app to find us easily each week, or join us on our email list at stdavidschurch.org/crossconnections. If you have questions for us, you can call us at 484-588-5656 and leave a voicemail with your name, where you're from, and your question or comment. Please note, we may use your recorded voice in an upcoming episode of Cross Connections. If you like what you hear, we'd love if you would share this with your friends and rate us in Spotify and Apple Podcasts or whatever other app you're using, so people can find us as well. Don't forget to visit our show notes for the year's reading list and any other resource links we've mentioned. Cross Connections is a ministry of St. David's Episcopal Church in Wayne, Pennsylvania. Season 2 Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley.
Elliot Van Hoy.
And Natalie Hill. Logo graphic design and podcast production by Natalie Hill. Stock media music provided by Marscott and Mood Mode Pond 5. You're welcome to learn more about all of St. David's worship and ministries at stdavidschurch.org.
Job.
Job.